Hey, what is up, everyone? I hope you guys are doing well. Today we got a unique story narrated by my friend Frederick. I hope you guys enjoy it and watch till the end, guys.
In the grim darkness of the far future, there exist warriors who have witnessed the rise and fall of empires, who remember events from millennia past with crystalline clarity, and who carry within their mechanical hearts the most dangerous commodity in the Imperium: truth. These are the ancient Dreadnoughts, space marines who have been entombed within walking sarcophagi of ceramite and adamantium, their broken bodies preserved within life support systems that keep them hovering in the space between life and death. They are living relics, their consciousness sustained across centuries and sometimes millennia, awakened only when their chapters have need of their wisdom or their overwhelming firepower. They are the keepers of their chapters' histories, the guardians of traditions that stretch back to the earliest days of the Imperium. And in some cases, they are witnesses to events that the Imperium would rather see forgotten. But here lies a terrible paradox. These venerable warriors, who should be celebrated as the ultimate repositories of their chapters' accumulated knowledge and experience, find themselves bound by chains far stronger than those that secure them to their walking tombs. They are forbidden, through methods both subtle and brutal, from speaking freely about certain events they have witnessed. The Imperium, that vast and paranoid bureaucracy that spans a million worlds, has deemed that some truths are too dangerous, too embarrassing, or too politically inconvenient to be allowed to circulate freely, even among the Space Marines themselves. The ancient Dreadnoughts who remember these forbidden periods occupy a unique and tragic position within the Imperial military hierarchy. They are simultaneously revered as fonts of wisdom and viewed with suspicion as potential threats to carefully maintained orthodoxies. Their very existence presents a problem for those who would rewrite history to serve political ends or to maintain the fragile stability of the Imperium. Unlike written records that can be destroyed, data files that can be corrupted, or witnesses who can be silenced permanently, Dreadnoughts persist. They sleep for decades or centuries, only to wake and potentially contradict the official narratives that have been constructed in their absence. Consider the implications of a Dreadnought who was interred during the Great Crusade, who fought alongside the Emperor himself and witnessed the glory of the Imperium before the Horus heresy tore it apart. Such a warrior would remember the Emperor not as the distant corpse god worshipped by the ecclesiarchy, but as a living, breathing warlord who walked among his gene-crafted sons. This ancient one would remember Primarchs, who are now condemned as traitors when they were still loyal, would recall the imperial truth that denied the existence of gods in favor of reason and science, and would know firsthand how different the Imperium was meant to be from what it has become. This knowledge, if spoken freely, could undermine 10,000 years of carefully constructed religious and political orthodoxy. Or consider a Dreadnought who witnessed the age of apostasy, that dark period in the 36th millennium when the ecclesiarch Goj Vandira seized control of the Imperium and plunged it into civil war. Such a witness would know uncomfortable truths about how the Space Marines largely stood aside while millions died under Vandira's tyrannical rule, how they fortified their own domains and pursued their own agendas while the Imperium burned. This knowledge contradicts the image of Space Marines as eternally vigilant protectors of humanity, always ready to sacrifice themselves for the Imperium's survival. It reveals a period where pragmatism and self-preservation took precedence over their supposed duty, and such revelations could damage the reputation of the Adeptus Astartes across the entire Imperium. The mechanisms by which ancient Dreadnoughts are silenced vary in their subtlety and brutality. Some are simply never awakened for anything other than the most desperate battles, kept in their dreamless sleep, where their dangerous memories cannot trouble anyone. Others are awakened only in the presence of chapter chaplains or high-ranking officers who can carefully control what questions are asked and what topics are discussed. Still others have had their memories selectively edited by the Mechanicum tech priests who maintain their life support systems. though this is a delicate and dangerous process that can damage the Dreadnought's consciousness irreparably. The most extreme cases involve the direct intervention of the Inquisition. When a Dreadnought possesses knowledge that the Inquisition deems too dangerous, they may be declared perdita, lost to all records. Their sarcophagus hidden away in the deepest vaults of their chapter's fortress monastery, where they will never be awakened again. In the most severe instances, Dreadnoughts have been destroyed outright, their gene seed recovered, and their names struck from the rolls of honor, erased as though they never existed. Such destructions are always couched in terms of mechanical failure or battle damage, but the pattern is clear to those with eyes to see it. Dreadnoughts who speak too freely about forbidden topics tend not to survive long. Throughout this examination, we will explore the specific events and periods that ancient Dreadnoughts are forbidden from discussing, the methods used to enforce this silence, and the profound implications this censorship has for our understanding of Imperial history. We will see how the Imperium's obsession with controlling the narrative of its past has created a situation where its most ancient and experienced warriors are treated as potential security threats, and how this reflects the broader paranoia and dysfunction that characterizes the Imperium of man in the 41st millennium. The ancient Dreadnoughts stand as tragic figures, simultaneously honored for their service and imprisoned by their knowledge, unable to fulfill their role as teachers and historians, because the truths they carry are deemed too dangerous for others to hear. The nature of Dreadnought, memory, and experience. To understand why ancient Dreadnoughts represent such a unique challenge for those who would control Imperial history, we must first understand what it means to exist as a Dreadnought and how their consciousness differs from both mortal humans and their battle brothers who still walk in flesh and blood. A Dreadnought is not simply a space marine in a mechanical body. They are something altogether different, a consciousness suspended in a state that is neither truly alive nor completely dead, maintained by arcane life support systems that date back to the dark age of technology. When a space marine is mortally wounded, typically with injuries so severe that even the advanced medical capabilities of the chapter's apothecaries cannot save them, they may be offered a final chance to continue serving the Emperor. If their spirit is deemed strong enough and their strategic value high enough, they will be interred within a Dreadnought sarcophagus. This is not a simple process of placing a wounded warrior in a suit of armor. Instead, what remains of their broken body is surgically integrated with the life support systems of the sarcophagus itself. Their nervous system is spliced into the machine's control mechanisms, their sensory organs replaced with or supplemented by mechanical sensors, and their consciousness maintained by a combination of biological support systems and cybernetic enhancements. The experience of existing as a Dreadnought is fundamentally different from normal human consciousness. The biological portions of their brain remain functional, preserving their memories and personality, but they perceive the world through mechanical sensors that translate physical reality into data streams. They no longer feel the touch of wind or the warmth of sunlight. They do not taste food or experience the simple pleasure of a deep breath. Their existence has been reduced to consciousness without the full spectrum of sensory experience that defines human life. Many Dreadnoughts describe their existence as a kind of half-life, neither fully alive nor able to embrace death, suspended in a state that is profoundly isolating. But this isolation comes with a terrible gift: perfect recall. Unlike living humans whose memories fade and blur with time, Dreadnoughts maintain their memories with a clarity that can be both blessing and curse. Their biological memories are supported by the machine systems of their sarcophagus, creating a kind of hybrid memory storage that is far more reliable than purely organic recall. A Dreadnought who was interred 5,000 years ago can remember events from their time as a flesh and blood warrior with the same clarity as though they happened yesterday. The faces of long-dead battle brothers, the words spoken before battles whose participants are all dust, the exact sequence of events during campaigns that have become legend, All of this is preserved within their consciousness with unsettling accuracy. This perfect recall makes dreadnoughts invaluable as historical sources. While written records can be destroyed, corrupted, or deliberately falsified, and while oral traditions can drift and change with each retelling, a dreadnought's memory remains constant. They are living primary sources, eyewitnesses to events that occurred millennia in the past, capable of providing detailed accounts that can settle historical disputes or correct inaccuracies in the official records. For a chapter seeking to understand its own history or to maintain the continuity of its traditions, ancient dreadnoughts are irreplaceable resources. However, this same perfect recall is precisely what makes them dangerous to those who would control the narrative of imperial history. A dreadnought cannot be convinced that their memories are mistaken. They cannot be persuaded that events happened differently than they remember. They are immune to the kind of gradual historical revision that the Imperium uses to reshape the past to serve present political needs. When a dreadnought speaks about an event they witnessed, they do so with absolute certainty, and their accounts cannot be easily dismissed as unreliable or biased. The sleep cycles that dreadnoughts experience between battles add another layer of complexity to their role as historical witnesses. Most dreadnoughts spend the vast majority of their existence in a state of suspended animation, their consciousness shut down to a minimal level to preserve their failing biological systems. They may sleep for decades or even centuries between awakenings, stirred from their slumber only when their chapter has desperate need of their combat capabilities or their accumulated wisdom. When they wake, they find themselves thrust into a galaxy that has continued to change in their absence, where old comrades have died and been replaced by warriors who were not even born when the dreadnought last walked. This pattern of sleeping and waking creates a peculiar relationship with time. A dreadnought may have been interred 10,000 years ago, but they have experienced only a tiny fraction of those years consciously. They are travelers through time, skipping across the millennia like a stone across water, touching down briefly before being plunged back into darkness. Each awakening brings them to a point further into the future, and with each awakening, they find that the gap between their memories and the present reality has grown wider. This temporal displacement means that dreadnoughts often possess knowledge of events that the current generation of their chapter knows only through legend or written records. They can correct mistakes in the chapter's official histories, provide context for traditions whose original meanings have been forgotten, and offer insights into long-dead heroes who have become mythologized beyond recognition. They are living bridges between past and present, capable of maintaining continuity across time spans that would otherwise see traditions erode and histories become corrupted. But this bridging role also makes them dangerous. As the millennia pass, the official narratives of events inevitably diverge from what actually happened. Political expedience, the loss of records, deliberate falsification, and simple misunderstanding all contribute to a gradual transformation of history into mythology. Events that were complex and morally ambiguous become simplified into clear narratives of good versus evil. Failures are forgotten or recast as noble sacrifices. Shameful episodes are erased entirely from the records. The Imperium's history, as it is taught and believed in the present day, is a carefully curated version of the truth, shaped to serve the needs of those in power and to maintain the social order. When an ancient dreadnought wakes and begins to speak about events as they actually happened, they threaten to disrupt this carefully maintained historical narrative. They remember the messy reality behind the legends, the political maneuvering behind what are presented as righteous crusades, the mistakes and failures that have been written out of the official histories. Their testimonies have the power to reveal uncomfortable truths about the Imperium's past, to show that revered heroes had feet of clay, that celebrated victories came at costs that were deliberately concealed, and that events that are presented as inevitable were actually the result of specific choices and failures. The value of Dreadnought testimony is well understood by chapter leadership. When questions arise about ancient traditions or historical events, it is to the ancient Dreadnoughts that chapter masters and librarians turn for authoritative answers. The venerable ones are consulted on matters of chapter doctrine, on the correct interpretation of ancient oaths and compacts, on the proper execution of rituals whose meanings have become obscure. Their role as living repositories of institutional memory makes them essential to the continuity and identity of their chapters. Yet this same value makes them targets for external control. The Inquisition and other imperial authorities understand that dreadnoughts represent potential security risks. A dreadnought who speaks openly about events that the Imperium has chosen to suppress could cause political damage far beyond their immediate chapter. If such testimony were to spread, if it were to be recorded and distributed, it could undermine carefully maintained orthodoxies and call into question the legitimacy of current power structures. Therefore, mechanisms must be in place to ensure that dreadnoughts do not speak too freely, that their dangerous memories are contained and controlled. The tragedy of the dreadnoughts' situation is that they are simultaneously honored and mistrusted, revered for their wisdom and feared for their knowledge. They occupy a position of respect within their chapters, addressed as Ancient One or Venerable Brother, and consulted on important decisions, yet they are also carefully monitored and restricted. Their testimonies are sought when convenient, but suppressed when they become inconvenient. They are expected to serve as teachers and historians, yet they are forbidden from teaching the full truth of what they know. This creates a profound psychological burden for those dreadnoughts who are aware of the restrictions placed upon them. They carry knowledge that they know should be shared, truths that would correct dangerous misconceptions and prevent the repetition of past mistakes. Yet they are forced to remain silent. They watch as their chapters and the Imperium at large labor under false understandings of history, making decisions based on incomplete or inaccurate information, all because the truth they could provide has been deemed too dangerous to speak. The weight of this enforced silence, combined with the already considerable burden of their half-life existence, can drive even the most steadfast warrior to despair. The Horus Heresy's hidden truths. Of all the events that ancient dreadnoughts are forbidden or discouraged from discussing in detail, none carries more weight or sensitivity than the Horus Heresy itself. The galaxy-spanning civil war that nearly destroyed the Imperium 10,000 years ago remains the defining trauma of imperial history, the great betrayal that set the tone for everything that followed. The official narratives of the heresy have been carefully crafted over the millennia, shaped by the ecclesiarchy, the Inquisition, and various political interests into a clear story of heroic loyalists fighting against the corrupted traitors. Yet the reality, as remembered by those dreadnoughts who actually fought in the heresy, is far more complex and far more troubling. The first and perhaps most fundamental issue is the sheer number of dreadnoughts who survive from that era. While 10,000 years is an immense span of time, and the vast majority of the heresy's participants have long since died, dreadnoughts represent a unique form of preservation. A warrior who was mortally wounded during the Siege of Terror or the Dropsite massacre of Istvan V, and subsequently interred in a dreadnought sarcophagus, could, theoretically, still be active in the 41st millennium. Most such ancient warriors have fallen in battle over the intervening millennia, but some persist, sleeping in the deepest vaults of their chapters' fortress monasteries, awakened only for the most desperate battles. These heresy-era dreadnoughts represent an existential threat to the official narratives, because they remember the emperor not as the distant god figure worshipped by the ecclesiarchy, but as a living being. They fought under his direct command during the Great Crusade. They heard him speak, watched him make decisions, and witnessed his interactions with the primarchs and the common soldiers of the Imperium. Their memories contradict the mythology that has grown up around the emperor, revealing him as a brilliant but flawed leader rather than an infallible deity. More problematically, these ancient warriors remember the imperial truth, the atheistic philosophy that the emperor promoted during the Great Crusade. They remember a time when the Imperium explicitly rejected religious worship, when faith in gods was seen as superstition to be eradicated. They participated in campaigns to destroy religious movements and suppress worship. The fact that the Imperium has now become the most fanatically religious human civilization in history, that it has embraced everything the emperor supposedly fought against, represents a profound ideological shift that these ancient warriors are uniquely positioned to critique. Their testimonies could undermine the theological foundations of the imperial cult, revealing it as a betrayal of the emperor's original vision rather than the fulfillment of it. The heresy-era Dreadnoughts also remember the traitor Primarchs and their legions before they turned. They fought alongside lunar wolves, who later became sons of Horus, alongside Thousand Sons before Magnus fell to chaos, alongside Death Guard, who remained loyal even as their legion fractured. These memories complicate the simple narrative of the heresy as a clear division between good and evil. The Dreadnoughts remember that many of those who became traitors were once brothers, that the line between loyalty and treason was often determined by circumstances and chance as much as by any fundamental moral difference. Perhaps most dangerously, some Dreadnoughts carry memories of loyalist space marines from the traitor legions. These warriors, members of legions that ultimately sided with Horus, but who themselves remained faithful to the emperor, represent a particularly sensitive topic. The official imperial doctrine holds that the traitor legions were corrupted to their core, that their gene seed is tainted, and their successors are damned. But Dreadnoughts remember loyalist Death Guard, sons of Horus, who rejected their Primarch's betrayal, World Eaters who fled rather than participate in the betrayal at Istvan III. These loyalist remnants from traitor legions pose a severe ideological problem for the Imperium. If members of the traitor legions could remain loyal, if their gene seed was not inherently corrupted, then the sweeping condemnations of entire legions become harder to justify. More troublingly, what became of these loyalists after the heresy? Some joined the Grey Knights or became Black Shields, their origins obscured. Others may have been integrated into loyalist chapters in the aftermath of the heresy, their gene seed mixed with that of loyalist legions to produce new chapters. If this is true, then the genetic purity that chapters prize so highly may be a fiction, and some chapters descended from loyalist Primarchs may carry gene seed from traitor legions. Dreadnoughts who remember these loyalist remnants, or who themselves come from traitor legion stock, represent a walking challenge to imperial orthodoxy. Their very existence proves that gene seed alone does not determine loyalty, that the deterministic view of genetics promoted by much of imperial ideology is flawed. They demonstrate that individuals could resist the corruption that claimed their Primarchs and brothers. And this truth empowers those who would question the rigid hierarchies and predetermined roles that characterize imperial society. The tactical and strategic realities of the heresy, as remembered by participating Dreadnoughts, also contradict many elements of the official narrative. The imperial version of the heresy emphasizes the heroism of the loyalists and the perfidy of the traitors, but those who fought in it remember a more complex reality. They remember mistakes made by loyalist commanders, opportunities missed, intelligence failures, and internecine conflicts among the loyalists themselves. They remember that Horus nearly won, not because he was more powerful, but because he had the element of surprise, and because the loyalists were slow to respond to the threat. These ancient warriors also remember the full horror of what the heresy entailed. While the official histories acknowledge the immense casualties, those who lived through it can describe in visceral detail what it meant when legions turned on each other, when brothers who had fought together for decades suddenly found themselves trying to kill one another. They remember the viral bombing of Istvan III, where billions died in agony as the loyalist elements of the traitor legions were purged. They remember the drop site massacre, where thousands of space marines were slaughtered in a carefully planned ambush. They remember the siege of Terra, where the cradle of humanity was turned into a charnel house. The psychological trauma of the heresy, as preserved in the memories of these ancient warriors, reveals a dimension of the conflict that is often glossed over in official accounts.
You know, researching this topic really made me think about how tragic the Dreadnoughts' existence truly is. We often celebrate them as these immortal warriors, but imagine being one of these ancients who remembers the truth about the heresy. You wake up after centuries of sleep and everyone around you is living a lie about events you actually witnessed. You want to correct them, to teach them, to prevent them from making the same mistakes again, but you can't. You're literally a prisoner of your own memories. What really gets me is that the Imperium creates these warriors specifically to preserve knowledge and wisdom across the ages, then systematically prevents them from fulfilling that purpose. It's such a perfect example of the Imperium's self-destructive paranoia. They're so afraid of uncomfortable truths that they'd rather repeat the same catastrophic mistakes than let their most experienced warriors speak freely. That's not strength, that's cowardice dressed up as security. Anyways, that's just my personal opinion. Let's continue the story.
The heresy was not simply a military conflict, but a profound psychological and spiritual crisis. Loyalist space marines, who had fought beside the traitors, struggled with feelings of betrayal and confusion. Some questioned their own loyalty, or wondered if they had missed signs of the coming betrayal. Others wrestled with survivor's guilt, wondering why they had survived when so many of their brothers had fallen. The psychological wounds of the heresy persist in the memories of the Dreadnoughts who survived it, and their testimonies reveal the full human cost of the conflict in ways that sanitized historical accounts cannot. Another sensitive topic related to the heresy concerns the fate of the missing legions, the 2nd and 11th. All official records of these legions have been expunged from Imperial archives, their primarchs' names struck from all monuments, their very existence rendered into a void in Imperial history. Yet some of the oldest Dreadnoughts may retain memories from before the expungement, may remember these missing legions and their fates. If such memories exist, they represent perhaps the most closely guarded secrets in the Imperium, truths that the Emperor himself deemed too dangerous to be known. The Mechanicum's role during the heresy is another area where Dreadnought testimony could prove problematic. The official narrative presents the Mechanicum as largely loyal, with only the Dark Mechanicum falling to chaos. But Dreadnoughts, who fought alongside Mechanicum forces, remember a more ambiguous picture. They remember tech priests whose loyalties were unclear, Forge worlds that tried to remain neutral in the conflict, and Mechanicum forces that switched sides multiple times as circumstances changed. They remember that the Mechanicum's support for the loyalist cause was often conditional and self-interested, rather than unconditional loyalty to the Emperor. The establishment of the current imperial order in the aftermath of the heresy is another topic where ancient testimony could prove inconvenient. The Codex Astartes, the division of the legions into chapters, the creation of the Inquisition, all of these foundational institutions of the Imperium were created in specific historical circumstances by individuals with specific goals and biases. Dreadnoughts who remember the debates and conflicts that shaped these institutions can provide context that complicates the reverence with which they are now regarded. They remember that Robert Guillemard's reorganization of the Space Marines was controversial, that some loyalist primarchs opposed breaking up the legions, that the decisions made in the aftermath of the heresy were as much about preventing future rebellions as they were about maintaining the Emperor's vision. Perhaps most fundamentally, heresy-era Dreadnoughts remember what the Imperium was supposed to become. They remember the Emperor's vision of a unified humanity, freed from superstition and fear, ruled by reason and scientific understanding. They remember the optimism of the Great Crusade, the sense that humanity was on the verge of a golden age, and they can compare that vision with the grim reality of the Imperium in the 41st millennium, a stagnant, declining civilization mired in superstition, where scientific innovation is heresy and human life has become cheap. The heresy derailed the Emperor's plans, but the Imperium that emerged from it has betrayed his vision as thoroughly as any traitor ever could. This knowledge, if spoken freely, could be profoundly demoralizing. It would reveal that everything the Imperium has become represents a departure from what it was meant to be, that the current order is not the fulfillment of the Emperor's plan, but a perversion of it. For the authorities of the Imperium, this is intolerable. The legitimacy of their rule rests on the claim that they are carrying out the Emperor's will, that the current order represents continuity with the vision established during the Great Crusade. Testimony from those who actually served during the Crusade and remember the Emperor's actual intentions threatens to expose this claim as a lie. Therefore, heresy-era dreadnoughts are carefully managed. They are consulted on tactical matters and questions of chapter tradition, but they are discouraged from offering broader commentary on the state of the Imperium, or from making comparisons between the present and the past. Chaplains and high-ranking officers carefully monitor what questions are asked of them and steer conversations away from sensitive topics. In some cases, these ancient warriors have learned to self-censor, understanding that speaking too freely about what they remember will result in them being returned to sleep and never awakened again. They have become complicit in the suppression of their own memories, choosing the limited existence of occasional awakening over the permanent silence of never being disturbed again. The Age of Apostasy, a shameful chapter. While the Horus heresy represents ancient history that requires the testimony of 10,000-year-old dreadnoughts to contradict, the Age of Apostasy is a far more recent wound in imperial history, occurring in the 36th millennium, only 5,000 years before the present day. Many dreadnoughts who fought during this period still survive, and their memories of this dark age represent a particular embarrassment for the Imperium, and especially for the Space Marines themselves. The Age of Apostasy reveals a side of the Adeptus Astartes that contradicts their self-image as selfless protectors of humanity, showing them instead as parochial and self-interested, willing to stand aside while the Imperium burned as long as their own domains remained secure. The Age of Apostasy began with the rise of Göge Vandir, who through political maneuvering and assassination secured control of both the administratum and the ecclesiarchy, making himself the most powerful man in the Imperium after the Emperor himself. Vandir's reign, known as the Reign of Blood, was characterized by paranoia, brutality, and megalomania. He purged anyone he suspected of disloyalty, imposed bizarre and cruel edicts on the populations under his control, and diverted vast resources to feed his own vanity and ambition. Entire populations were tithed beyond their ability to pay. Whole worlds were brought to ruin to construct vast monuments to his glory, and those who objected were met with purges carried out by his private army, the Frateries Templar, and his elite bodyguard, the Daughters of the Emperor. For nearly a century, Vandir's tyranny went largely unchallenged by the institutions that should have stopped him. The Inquisition was divided and uncertain how to proceed against someone who technically held legitimate authority. The Imperial Guard lacked the unity and leadership to mount an effective resistance. The planetary governors, many of whom owed their positions to Vandir or feared his retribution, largely submitted to his rule even when his edicts brought devastation to their worlds. And the Space Marines, those supposedly incorruptible warriors who had sworn oaths to protect the Imperium and its citizens, largely stood aside. This is the shameful truth that dreadnoughts from this period remember. The Adeptus Astartes, as an institution, failed to act during the Age of Apostasy. Individual chapters had their reasons, of course. Vandir was cunning enough not to directly threaten the Space Marines' autonomy, and as long as he left them alone to govern their own domains and pursue their own wars, many chapters saw no reason to involve themselves in what they viewed as internal imperial politics. The Space Marines had learned from the Horus heresy to be wary of taking sides in conflicts between imperial authorities. They had also developed a certain contempt for baseline humans and their political squabbles, viewing such matters as beneath the concern of the Emperor's gene-forged warriors. Dreadnoughts from this era remember the debates within their chapters about whether to intervene. They remember chapter masters arguing that Vandire's reign, however brutal, was a matter for the ecclesiarchy and administratum to resolve, that the Space Marines should not set themselves up as kingmakers or involve themselves in selecting imperial leadership. They remember the decision to fortify their own domains and let the rest of the Imperium burn, the calculation that Vandire's tyranny would eventually burn itself out and that it was not worth the cost of intervention. They remember the rationalization that the Space Marines' primary duty was to fight Xenos and Chaos threats, not to involve themselves in what was, technically, a purely internal human conflict. Some chapters did eventually join the rebellion led by Sebastian Thor, but only after the situation had become so dire that even the isolationist chapters could no longer ignore it. The Space Marines who did join the rebellion found themselves laying siege to the ecclesiarchal palace on Terra itself, fighting against other imperial forces, the Frateres Templar and the Daughters of the Emperor, in battles that were uncomfortably reminiscent of the heresy. The fighting was brutal and costly, and even after the Adeptus Custodes intervened and convinced the Daughters of the Emperor to turn against Vandire, the damage to the Imperium had been immense. In the aftermath of Vandire's fall, the reforms instituted by Sebastian Thor included measures specifically designed to prevent such a concentration of power from occurring again. The decree passive forbade the ecclesiarchy from maintaining men under arms, though the creation of the Adepta Sororitas sidestepped this prohibition through a legalistic interpretation. The Ordo Hereticus was established to police threats from within the Imperium's own institutions, and although it is rarely discussed openly, there were quiet reforms within the Space Marines themselves, renewed emphasis on their duty to the broader Imperium, and not simply to their own chapters. But the damage to the reputation of the Adeptus Astartes could not be so easily repaired. The Age of Apostasy had revealed that the Space Marines, for all their genetic enhancement and indoctrination, were capable of the same political calculation and self-interest as any other imperial institution. They had failed to live up to the heroic ideal that had been constructed around them, had proven themselves capable of standing aside while innocent humans suffered and died under tyranny. This knowledge, if widely disseminated, could severely damage the mystique and authority of the Adeptus Astartes. Dreadnoughts who lived through this period remember all of this with uncomfortable clarity. They remember the arguments within their chapters, the debates about whether to intervene, the decision to prioritize chapter interests over the broader good of the Imperium. Some of these ancient warriors supported the decision not to intervene, believing it was the right course of action, given the circumstances. Others argued strenuously for action and found themselves overruled by their chapter leadership. Still others participated in the eventual rebellion and remember the brutal fighting against forces that should have been allies. These memories are particularly dangerous because they contradict one of the foundational myths of the modern Imperium, that the Space Marines are selfless heroes who always put duty above all other considerations. The Age of Apostasy reveals this to be at best a simplification and at worst a complete fabrication. The Space Marines are capable of selfishness, of political calculation, of prioritizing their own interests over the good of the Imperium. They are, despite all their enhancements and indoctrination, still capable of moral failure. Moreover, the Age of Apostasy revealed uncomfortable truths about the relationship between the Space Marines and the rest of the Imperium. The Adeptus Astartes exists somewhat outside the normal imperial hierarchy, autonomous to a degree that few other institutions enjoy. While this autonomy allows them to operate effectively and pursue long-term strategies without political interference, it also creates a disconnect between them and the rest of humanity. During the Age of Apostasy, This disconnect allowed the Space Marines to treat the suffering of normal humans as someone else's problem, a matter not worthy of their attention as long as it did not directly threaten their own operations. The Mechanicum showed a similar detachment during this period, continuing to operate their forge worlds and produce weapons and equipment while remaining largely aloof from the political conflict consuming the rest of the Imperium. Dreadnoughts remember that both institutions, the Space Marines and the Mechanicum, behaved during the Age of Apostasy in ways that revealed their fundamental alienation from the human populations they were supposedly protecting. This alienation persists in the 41st millennium, but the Age of Apostasy provided a particularly stark demonstration of its consequences. Another sensitive aspect of this period concerns the specific actions taken by individual chapters. While the Adeptus Astartes as a whole can be criticized for inaction, specific chapters took actions during this period that were actively shameful. Some chapters used the chaos of the Age of Apostasy as cover to settle old grudges or seize territory. Others took advantage of the collapse of central authority to expand their own power and influence. A few chapters were implicated in atrocities committed against civilian populations, justifying their actions as necessary to maintain order or prevent the spread of heresy. Dreadnoughts who witnessed these actions or who participated in them carry particularly burdensome memories. They remember orders they would rather forget, actions they took that haunt them across the centuries. Some have sought absolution through confession to chaplains or through renewed dedication to their duties. Others have rationalized their actions as necessary given the circumstances. But all of them know that their chapter's actions during this period do not reflect well on the Adeptus Astartes as an institution. The political aftermath of the Age of Apostasy also created ongoing sensitivities. The reforms that followed Vandire's fall redistributed power within the Imperium and created new institutions like the Ordo Hereticus. Some Space Marine chapters opposed these reforms, viewing them as unwanted interference in their affairs or as limitations on their autonomy. The debates about these reforms and the positions taken by various chapters remain sensitive topics even 5,000 years later because they reveal divisions and disagreements that the Imperium would prefer to pretend do not exist. Furthermore, the Age of Apostasy demonstrated the fragility of the Imperium's political order. Vandire's reign showed how easily the checks and balances of imperial governance could be subverted by a sufficiently ruthless and cunning individual. The fact that it took nearly a century to remove him from power, and that his removal required a combination of popular rebellion, internal betrayal, and intervention by the Adeptus Custodes themselves, revealed the Imperium's vulnerability to internal threats. This knowledge is dangerous because it suggests that the Imperium's apparent strength and stability are more fragile than official propaganda suggests. The role of Sebastian Thor in ending the Age of Apostasy also creates complications for the official narrative. Thor was, by all accounts, a genuinely charismatic and inspirational figure who rallied millions to his cause through the power of his personality and his message of reform. His success in overthrowing Vandire and reforming the ecclesiarchy made him one of the most important figures in imperial history. However, the specifics of his rise to power and the methods he used are less clear, and dreadnoughts who lived through this period may remember details that complicate the heroic narrative. Some accounts suggest that Thor had connections to banned religious movements, that he drew on traditions that the ecclesiarchy had previously suppressed. There are hints in some records that his movement involved elements that would later be considered heretical, or that he made compromises and alliances that would not fit comfortably with his later canonization as a saint. Dreadnoughts, who remember the actual Sebastian Thor rather than the mythologized saint, could provide testimony that would complicate his status as one of the Imperium's great heroes. The Age of Apostasy also saw significant warp storm activity that isolated many parts of the Imperium from Terra. Some historians have speculated that this was not entirely natural, that forces opposed to Vandire somehow manipulated warp currents to prevent him from projecting power into distant regions, while simultaneously allowing Sebastian Thor's forces to travel relatively freely. If this is true, it raises uncomfortable questions about who had the power to manipulate the warp on such a scale and what their ultimate agenda might have been. Dreadnoughts who fought during this period might have observations or memories that could shed light on these mysteries, making their testimony particularly valuable and dangerous. The aftermath of the Age of Apostasy included extensive purges of those who had supported or benefited from Vandire's rule. These purges were necessary to remove collaborators and restore trust in imperial institutions, but they were also chaotic and sometimes targeted innocent individuals who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Some Space Marine chapters participated in these purges, hunting down and executing former Vandire loyalists. The methods used and the standards of evidence applied varied widely, and in some cases, these purges devolved into little more than organized murder. Dreadnoughts who participated in or witnessed these purges remember the moral complexity and the occasional atrocities. They know that not everyone executed in the aftermath of the Age of Apostasy was guilty of the crimes they were accused of, that the chaos of the period created opportunities for score settling and abuse. This knowledge is uncomfortable because it reveals that even the post-apostasy reforms, generally portrayed as a return to righteous rule, were accompanied by their own injustices and failures. The Badab War, brothers against brothers. While the Age of Apostasy occurred 5,000 years ago and the Horus Heresy 10,000 years before the present, the Badab War is a fresh wound, having concluded barely a century and a half ago in the early 42nd millennium. This recent conflict saw multiple Space Marine chapters turn against the Imperium in a rebellion led by Luft-Huron of the Astral Claws. And the brutal civil war that followed left deep scars on all involved. Dreadnoughts who participated in this conflict, both on the loyalist and secessionist sides, carry memories that the Imperium would desperately prefer to keep suppressed, as the Badab War reveals uncomfortable truths about the current state of the Adeptus Astartes and the tensions that threaten to tear them apart. The Badab War began as a dispute over imperial tithes and gradually escalated into open rebellion. Luft-Huron, chapter master of the Astral Claws, had been appointed as overall commander of the Maelstrom Warders, a coalition of chapters tasked with defending the regions around the Maelstrom warp storm. Frustrated by what he saw as inadequate support from the Administratum and the High Lords of Terror, and convinced that more aggressive action was needed to secure the region, Huron began to withhold tithes and expand his chapter beyond the limits prescribed by the Codex Astartes. What followed was a complex series of political and military maneuvers, with accusations and counter-accusations flying between Huron's supporters and his critics. Several other chapters, the Lamenters, Mantis Warriors, and Executioners, sided with Huron, either out of loyalty to their brother, chapter master, or because they shared his grievances against the Imperium's governance. When imperial authorities finally moved against Huron, it triggered a full-scale war that lasted for over a decade and involved nearly a dozen Space Marine chapters on both sides. The Badab War is sensitive for multiple reasons, all of which make Dreadnought testimony about it particularly dangerous. First and foremost, it was a conflict in which Space Marines fought against other Space Marines, brother against brother, in battles that saw thousands of the Emperor's finest warriors killing each other. The sheer waste of this fratricide, the loss of irreplaceable genetic and military resources, stands as an indictment of the Imperium's dysfunction. Even more troublingly, the war revealed that under sufficient pressure, Space Marines could be turned against each other, that their loyalty to their chapters could trump their loyalty to the Imperium as a whole. Dreadnoughts who fought in the Badab War remember the initial confusion and disbelief as word spread that the Astral Claws had refused Imperial orders. Many chapters initially tried to mediate, hoping to resolve the situation without violence. These dreadnoughts remember the negotiations and discussions that preceded the outbreak of open warfare, the attempts to find a peaceful resolution, and the gradual realization that compromise was impossible. They remember the moment when the Imperium committed to using force to bring Huron to heel, and the recognition that Space Marines would soon be fighting other Space Marines. For those Dreadnoughts who fought on the Loyalist side, the Badab War was a traumatic experience that forced them to treat other Space Marines as enemies. These ancient warriors had been awakened expecting to fight Xenos or Chaos forces, only to find themselves deployed against brothers who, in many cases, they had fought alongside in previous campaigns. They remember the surreal experience of using tactics designed for fighting orcs or Tyranids against targets who thought and fought like Space Marines because they were Space Marines. They remember the high casualty rates on both sides, the brutal close-quarters fighting, and the gradual erosion of any sense that this was a war with a righteous purpose. The Loyalist chapters involved in the Badab War included the Red Scorpions, Firehawks, Carcharodons, Minotaurs, and others. Each brought their own approach to the conflict, and not all of these approaches were honorable. The Carcharodons, in particular, earned a dark reputation during the war for the ferocity and apparent sadism of their attacks. Dreadnoughts who witnessed the Carcharodons in action remember tactics that seemed designed to terrorize as much as to defeat the enemy, and actions that crossed the line from necessary warfare into what looked suspiciously like revenge and bloodlust. The secessionist Dreadnoughts, those who fought alongside Huron, carry even more problematic memories. Some of these ancient warriors genuinely believed in Huron's cause, convinced that he was right to resist what they saw as imperial corruption and incompetence. Others were simply following their chapter's commands, loyal to their battle brothers, even if they harbored doubts about the righteousness of their cause. These Dreadnoughts remember the growing desperation as the secessionist forces were gradually overwhelmed by superior Loyalist numbers, the realization that they were going to lose, and the final brutal battles as the Astral Claw's homeworld of Badab Primaris was invaded and destroyed. Ancient Clytor, a venerable dreadnought of the Astral Claws, was destroyed during the Badab War by Captain Silas Alberek of the Exorcists chapter. The accounts of this battle, as remembered by those who witnessed it, reveal the tragedy of the conflict. Clytor was an honored ancient, a former captain who had served faithfully for centuries before his internment. Yet he died fighting against Loyalist forces, branded a traitor and a heretic. His name added to the rolls of the dishonored rather than the honored. For the Astral Claws and their successor chapter, the Red Corsairs, Clytor's fate symbolizes the larger tragedy of the Badab War, the transformation of honorable warriors into condemned traitors through a series of escalating commitments and miscalculations. The Loyalist Dreadnoughts who fought in the Badab War also had to confront the uncomfortable reality that not all of those they killed were corrupted or evil. Many of the secessionist Space Marines, particularly in the Lamenters and Mantis warriors, were relatively innocent, having followed their chapter masters into rebellion more out of loyalty than out of any genuine opposition to the Imperium. These warriors died just as bravely as their Loyalist opponents, fought with just as much skill and determination, and in their final moments showed just as much devotion to their brothers and their chapters. The Loyalist Dreadnoughts who witnessed this cannot help but recognize that these were not monsters or traitors in any meaningful sense, but fellow Space Marines caught up in circumstances beyond their control. The aftermath of the Badab War has been carefully managed by Imperial authorities to minimize the damage to the reputation of the Adeptus Astartes and to the broader legitimacy of Imperial rule. The surviving members of the secessionist chapters were subjected to harsh penalties. The Astral Claws, who had fully embraced chaos by the war's end, were declared excommunicate traitoris, and their remnants fled into the Maelstrom, where they reformed as the Red Corsairs under Huron Blackheart's leadership. The Lamenters, Mantis warriors, and executioners were placed on century-long penitent crusades, forced to atone for their participation in the rebellion through decades of dangerous service on the Imperium's most deadly frontiers. The loyalist chapters that participated in the war were rewarded with grants of territory and resources. But these rewards came with an implicit requirement to maintain silence about the more troubling aspects of the conflict. Dreadnoughts from both sides were strongly encouraged not to discuss their experiences in detail, particularly not with outsiders or with members of chapters that had not participated in the war. The Inquisition maintained a close watch on all veterans of the Badab War, and there were incidents where Space Marines who spoke too freely about their experiences suffered mysterious accidents or were declared renegade and hunted down. One of the most sensitive aspects of the Badab War concerns the evidence that emerged regarding Huron's genetic experimentation. The Astral Claws Apothecarian had been conducting forbidden research into rapid gene seed cultivation, attempting to expand their chapter's strength beyond Codex-mandated limits. This research, while largely unsuccessful, represented a direct violation of one of the most sacred prohibitions in Imperial law. The discovery of this experimentation raised uncomfortable questions about whether other chapters might be engaged in similar forbidden research, and whether the temptation to exceed Codex limitations might be more widespread than Imperial authorities wanted to admit. Dreadnoughts, who witnessed evidence of the Astral Claw's genetic research, remember the horror of seeing what their battle brothers had done in pursuit of greater strength. They remember failed experiments, Space Marines who had been subjected to unstable gene seed implantation and suffered catastrophic mutations or organ failure. They remember the rationalizations offered by the Astral Claws apothecaries, the arguments that such research was necessary given the threats they faced, that the Codex Astartes restrictions were outdated and unrealistic. These memories are dangerous because they reveal the extent to which even supposedly loyal chapters might be willing to break sacred laws in pursuit of what they perceive as military necessity. The political maneuvering that preceded and accompanied the Badab War also remains a sensitive topic. The initial conflict arose from disputes over resource allocation, imperial tithes, and questions of authority and jurisdiction. These are precisely the kinds of bureaucratic and political issues that the Imperium's propaganda claims Space Marines rise above. Yet the Badab War proved that chapters are just as capable as any other imperial institution of becoming embroiled in political disputes. Dreadnoughts who remember the negotiations and machinations that led to the war can testify to the very human motivations and miscalculations that transformed a manageable dispute into a devastating conflict. The role of the Inquisition in the Badab War is another area where testimony could prove problematic. Some accounts suggest that the Inquisition deliberately allowed the situation to escalate, either through incompetence or as a deliberate test of the Astral Claw's loyalty. Other accounts hint at rivalries within the Inquisition itself, with different factions supporting different outcomes. Dreadnoughts, who interacted with Inquisitors during this period, might have insights into the Inquisition's role that would complicate the official narrative of the war as a simple rebellion that was properly suppressed. The treatment of the Lamenters, Mantis warriors, and executioners after the war also reveals uncomfortable truths about imperial justice. These chapters had sided with Huron, but unlike the Astral Claws, they had not fully embraced chaos or committed the same level of crimes. Yet they were punished severely, subjected to penitent crusades that would see most of their warriors die in battles that were essentially suicide missions. The harshness of these punishments, disproportionate to the actual crimes committed, suggests that the Imperium needed to make an example of these chapters to discourage future rebellions. Dreadnoughts who witnessed the imposition of these sentences and the early stages of the penitent crusades remember a justice system that was more concerned with deterrence than with fairness. The final assault on Badab Primaris, which culminated in the near destruction of the planet's infrastructure and the apparent death of Lufocht Huron, involved levels of destructiveness that some dreadnoughts found excessive. The Star Phantoms, in particular, showed little mercy in their assault on the Palace of Thorns, using tactics that resulted in massive collateral damage and civilian casualties. While such ruthlessness might be justified in warfare against Xenos or Chaos forces, applying it against other Space Marines and the human populations under their protection struck some witnesses as vindictive rather than necessary. These observations, if widely known, could raise uncomfortable questions about how far the Imperium is willing to go to punish rebellion, even when that punishment creates suffering for innocent humans. The survival of Luft Huron and his transformation into Huron Blackheart, leader of the Red Corsairs, represents an ongoing security concern for the Imperium. The official accounts of the final battle at the Palace of Thorns report that Huron was mortally wounded by Captain Androcles of the Star Phantoms, with evidence suggesting he died from his injuries. Yet Huron clearly survived, though he was grievously wounded and required extensive bionic reconstruction. The failure to confirm his death and to prevent his escape has become a source of embarrassment for the chapters involved in the final assault. Dreadnoughts who participated in the final battles on Bardab Primaris remember the chaos and confusion as the planet's infrastructure collapsed around them. They remember that in the desperate final hours, many astral claws escaped, including apparently their chapter master. Some of these dreadnoughts have questioned whether Huron's survival and escape might have been permitted, whether some Imperial authorities might have preferred to have him as an ongoing external threat in the Maelstrom, rather than as a martyr whose death might inspire future rebellions. Such speculation, if voiced publicly, would be deeply troubling to Imperial authorities. The transformation of the Astral Claws into the Red Corsairs and their activities in the century since the Bardab War have proven the pessimists right. Huron has built the Red Corsairs into one of the largest and most dangerous Chaos Space Marine warbands, rivaling even the Black Legion in strength and resources. The Red Corsair's success demonstrates that the Bardab War, despite the enormous cost in lives and resources, failed in its ultimate objective of eliminating the threat posed by Huron's ambitions. This failure is a source of embarrassment that Imperial authorities would prefer not to dwell upon, and Dreadnought testimony about the war's aftermath and the escape of significant Astral Claws forces into the Maelstrom could reignite debates about whether the war was prosecuted effectively. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Bardab War, from the perspective of Dreadnought witnesses, is the recognition that it could happen again. The underlying causes of the conflict, the tensions between chapter autonomy and Imperial authority, the disputes over resources and jurisdiction, the frustrations with bureaucratic inefficiency and political corruption, all of these remain unresolved. The Bardab War demonstrated that under sufficient pressure, Space Marine chapters can be driven to rebellion, that their loyalty to the Imperium has limits. This knowledge is profoundly destabilizing because it suggests that the Adeptus Astartes, the Imperium's ultimate guardians, might themselves pose a threat to Imperial stability under the right circumstances. The Cacodominus and the Howling. Among the multitude of threats that the Imperium has faced over its 10,000-year history, few have had such widespread and devastating consequences as the Cacodominus and the psychic catastrophe known as the Howling. This event, which occurred in the year 401 of the 34th millennium, represents one of the greatest disasters to befall the Imperium in the millennia following the Horus Heresy. Yet the details of what actually transpired remain shrouded in mystery and deliberate obfuscation. The few dreadnoughts who fought during this period and survived carry memories that Imperial authorities have worked diligently to suppress, as the full truth about the Cacodominus raises disturbing questions about the nature of psychic powers, the vulnerability of the Imperium's infrastructure, and the costs of victory against certain types of threats. The official records describe the Cacodominus as an alien cyborg psyker of immense power who managed to dominate and control approximately 1,300 planetary systems through psychic influence. The entity's powers were such that entire populations fell under its sway, becoming extensions of its will, unable to resist its commands, or even to conceive of resisting. This mental domination extended to military forces, planetary governors, and even, according to some accounts, to several Dreadblade Knights, massive war machines that should have been immune to such influence due to their machine spirits and the mental fortitude of their pilots. The Black Templars chapter took upon themselves the task of eliminating this threat, launching what came to be known as the Catalexis Heresy campaign to hunt down and destroy the Cacodominus. The chapter's crusade against the entity and its dominated servants lasted for years and cost countless lives, but eventually they succeeded in tracking the Cacodominus to its lair and executing it. However, the moment of victory became catastrophe when the Cacodominus's death scream echoed through the warp with unimaginable intensity. This psychic shriek, amplified by the entity's immense power, had devastating consequences across the entire Imperium. The death scream burned out the minds of an estimated 1 billion astropaths, the psychically gifted navigators who maintained the Imperium's communication network and guided ships through the warp. In a single moment, the Imperium lost a significant portion of its ability to coordinate across interstellar distances. The signal of the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon centered on Terra that allows warp travel throughout the Imperium, was distorted and weakened, making warp navigation far more dangerous and unpredictable. The immediate aftermath saw millions of ships lost in the warp. Unable to navigate without clear psychic guidance, entire subsectors descended into isolation and barbarism without the ability to communicate with the wider Imperium or to receive supplies and reinforcements. This event, known as the Howling, represents one of the greatest peacetime disasters in Imperial history, comparable in its immediate impact to some of the worst battles of the Horus Heresy. Yet despite its magnitude, remarkably few details about the Cacodominus itself or the circumstances of its death have survived in official Imperial records. The entity's origins remain unknown. Was it a naturally occurring alien being that developed psycho abilities, or was it artificially created, perhaps as a weapon from the dark age of technology? What motivated it to dominate so many systems? How did it achieve such power in the first place? And most troublingly, could similar entities exist elsewhere in the galaxy? Dreadnoughts who participated in the campaign against the Cacodominus, or who lived through the Howling, carry memories that could answer some of these questions. And that is precisely why their testimony is considered so dangerous. The first troubling truth concerns the Cacodominus's appearance and nature. The official designation of alien cyborg suggests an entity that was partly biological and partly mechanical, but Dreadnoughts who actually saw the creature describe something far more disturbing. Some accounts speak of a being that seemed to blend human and alien characteristics, with technological enhancements that appeared to be of human origin. This has led some to speculate that the Cacodominus might have had human elements, that it might have been the result of forbidden Dark Age experiments in cybernetic enhancement and psychic amplification. If the Cacodominus was, even partially, of human origin, this fact would have profound and troubling implications. It would suggest that humanity had once possessed the knowledge to create beings of godlike psychic power, that this knowledge still existed somewhere in the galaxy, and that it might be rediscovered. The Imperium's official stance on such research is unambiguous condemnation, treating any attempt to artificially enhance psychic abilities or to create new psychostrains as the worst form of tech heresy. Yet, if the Cacodominus demonstrated the potential power of such enhancement, there would inevitably be those who would be tempted to recreate or surpass its capabilities. The circumstances of how the Cacodominus was finally destroyed also remain deliberately vague in official accounts. The Black Templars are credited with executing the entity, but the specific methods used and the cost of the victory are not detailed. Dreadnoughts who participated in the final assault remember a battle that was as much psychic as physical, with the Black Templars' assault companies having to fight through layers of mental domination and psychic defenses before they could even reach the Cacodominus itself. Some accounts mention that the Black Templars lost their entire librarian corps in the assault, the chapter's psychers burning themselves out in the effort to shield their brothers from the Cacodominus's influence and to create a psychic null zone where it could be physically attacked. This loss of the Black Templars' librarians has become part of the chapter's legend and might explain why they have had no librarians since that time, having apparently abandoned the practice of recruiting and training psychers into their ranks. If true, this represents a significant sacrifice, the chapter voluntarily giving up an entire class of specialists in order to destroy the Cacodominus. However, it also raises questions about what exactly the Black Templars' librarians did in that final battle, what methods or powers they employed, and whether these methods might have been as heretical as the target they were directed against. The aftermath of the Howling created chaos throughout the Imperium that lasted for decades. Without reliable astropathic communication, the Central Imperial Authority on Terra lost contact with vast swaths of the galaxy. Without clear signals from the Astronomicon, warp travel became a desperate gamble, with ships often emerging from the warp far from their intended destinations, if they emerged at all. This period of isolation and confusion allowed numerous threats to flourish. Orc empires expanded unchecked. Chaos incursions that might normally have been quickly responded to instead festered and grew. Human worlds, cut off from the Imperium, had to fend for themselves or fell to conquest by Xenos forces. The economic and social disruption was equally severe. Trade routes that had functioned for millennia suddenly became impassable. Worlds dependent on imports of food or critical materials faced famine and collapse. The tithe system, already inefficient, became nearly impossible to enforce without reliable communication. Some worlds used the opportunity to stop paying their tithes entirely, either declaring independence or simply ceasing to acknowledge imperial authority. When imperial control was eventually re-established in these regions, the process was often brutal, with entire populations purged for the crime of having attempted to survive without imperial guidance. Dreadnoughts who lived through the Howling remember the fear and uncertainty of this period. They remember awakening to find their chapters cut off from the Imperium at large, uncertain whether Terra still existed or whether the entire imperial structure had collapsed. Some chapters used this period to pursue their own agendas, settling old scores or seizing territory without concern for imperial law. Others attempted to maintain order in their regions, becoming de facto protectors of local populations in the absence of any higher authority. The diversity of responses to the Howling revealed much about the true character of various chapters and the limits of their loyalty to the Imperium as opposed to their own interests. The psychic casualties of the Howling extended beyond the immediate loss of astropaths. Many untrained psychers, individuals who had managed to hide their abilities or who lived in regions where the Imperium's persecution of unsanctioned psychers was less thorough, were also affected by the death scream. Some were driven insane by the psychic backlash. Others found their dormant abilities suddenly activated by the surge of warp energy. The period following, the Howling, saw a significant increase in possession events, as the same warp disturbances that had killed so many trained psychers also created openings for demonic incursion. Entire worlds were lost to chaos during this period, their populations corrupted or destroyed by warp entities that flooded through the gaps in reality created by the Howling's aftermath. The Imperium's response to the Howling, once communication could be re-established, involved a massive effort to train replacement astropaths and to repair the damage to the Imperium's psychic infrastructure. This effort took decades and consumed enormous resources. It also provided an opportunity for the Inquisition and other imperial authorities to tighten control over psychers throughout the Imperium. New regulations were imposed, more stringent testing protocols implemented, and the persecution of unsanctioned psychers intensified. Some scholars have argued that the Howling marked a turning point in the Imperium's treatment of psychers, shifting from reluctant acceptance of necessary tools to paranoid control of dangerous weapons. One of the most troubling aspects of the Howling concerns what might be called the lessons learned, or rather, the lessons that imperial authorities chose to ignore. The Cacodóminus had demonstrated that a single powerful psyker could threaten the stability of a significant portion of the Imperium. The entity's death had shown that killing such a being could have consequences nearly as devastating as allowing it to live. These facts should have prompted serious strategic thinking about how to deal with psychic threats and what precautions might be necessary to prevent similar disasters in the future. However, Dreadnoughts, who participated in the deliberations following the Howling, remember a different response. Rather than developing new strategies or technologies to counter psychic threats, Imperial authorities largely chose to suppress information about the Cacodóminus and the Howling, apparently hoping that if the event was forgotten, similar threats would not emerge. This policy of willful ignorance, maintained through censorship and the suppression of witnesses' testimony, has left the Imperium vulnerable to similar psychic catastrophes should another entity like the Cacodóminus arise. The question of whether other beings like the Cacodóminus exist in the galaxy remains unanswered, largely because the suppression of information about the original entity makes it difficult to know what to look for. Are there similar alien cyborg psykers in unexplored regions of space? Could humanity itself produce such beings, either deliberately through forbidden research or accidentally through the random mutation of psychic abilities? The Imperium's policy has been to treat such questions as heretical speculation rather than legitimate strategic concerns. But Dreadnoughts, who remember the Cacodóminus and its aftermath, understand that pretending a threat does not exist does not make it go away. Another aspect of the Howling that remains sensitive concerns the fate of the Black Templars themselves in the immediate aftermath of the Cacodóminus's death. Some accounts suggest that the chapter was severely affected by the psychic backlash, that many of their warriors suffered psychological trauma from their proximity to the death scream. There are hints in some records of Black Templars who went mad in the years following the campaign, who had to be put down by their own brothers when they became uncontrollable. If these accounts are accurate, they suggest that the true cost of destroying the Cacodóminus was even higher than officially acknowledged, and that the Black Templars continue to bear scars from that victory even into the present day. The period known as the Astropath Wars, which followed the Howling, remains poorly documented in official records. This era apparently involved conflicts over the remaining functioning astropaths, with various factions attempting to monopolize this scarce resource for their own communication needs. Some accounts suggest that Space Marine chapters became involved in these conflicts, either as participants or as peacekeepers attempting to restore order. Dreadnoughts who were active during this period might have witnessed these conflicts and could testify to actions taken by their chapters that might not reflect well on the Adeptus Astartes if publicly known. Other forbidden topics and suppressed histories. While the Horus Heresy, the Age of Apostasy, the Badab War, and the Howling represent major events whose details are carefully controlled, there exist numerous other topics that ancient dreadnoughts are discouraged or forbidden from discussing. These range from failed campaigns and embarrassing defeats to internal chapter matters that would damage the reputation of the Adeptus Astartes if widely known. Collectively, these forbidden topics paint a picture of an Imperium whose official history is carefully curated to maintain specific narratives and to suppress uncomfortable truths about its past and present. The gene seed of several chapters carries flaws and mutations that have never been publicly acknowledged. While some genetic issues are well known, such as the Blood Angel's Red Thirst and Black Rage, or the Space Wolf's lupine mutations, other chapters harbor genetic abnormalities that remain carefully hidden. Dreadnoughts, particularly ancient ones who remember when their chapter's gene seed was stable, can testify to the emergence and progression of these mutations. However, such testimony is actively suppressed, because it would call into question the purity of these chapters and potentially lead to their censure or even dissolution. The history of some chapters includes periods of internal conflict or civil war that have been erased from official records. These conflicts might have arisen from disagreements about chapter doctrine, from the emergence of heretical beliefs within a portion of the chapter, or from simple power struggles between competing factions. Dreadnoughts who lived through these periods remember the bloodshed and the trauma of fighting against their own brothers, and they carry the knowledge of which current chapter traditions and practices emerged from these conflicts. This history is suppressed because it contradicts the image of Space Marine chapters as unified and disciplined brotherhoods. Several chapters have histories of alliances or relationships with Xeno species that would be considered heretical by current Imperial standards. During the Great Crusade and in the millennia since, there have been instances where pragmatic necessity led chapters to cooperate with aliens against common enemies. In some cases, these alliances were brief and circumstantial. In others, they involved deeper cooperation and even elements of cultural exchange. Dreadnoughts who participated in or witnessed these alliances remember a more complex relationship between humanity and Xenos than the current doctrine of absolute intolerance allows for. The Fallen, those Dark Angels who sided with Luther during the Legion's internal conflict 10,000 years ago, represent one of the most closely guarded secrets in the Imperium. While the Dark Angels and their successor chapters go to extraordinary lengths to hunt down and capture these traitors, they equally work to ensure that no one outside the chapter knows of their existence. Dreadnoughts from the Dark Angels, who remember the original betrayal, carry knowledge that could destroy their chapter if revealed. The existence of these Fallen and the Dark Angels' obsessive pursuit of them demonstrates that the heresy's effects continue to reverberate into the present, that the wounds of that ancient conflict have never truly healed. The lost or destroyed chapters whose fates have been hidden represent another category of forbidden knowledge. Throughout the Imperium's history, numerous Space Marine chapters have been destroyed, either in catastrophic defeats against enemy forces or through internal corruption and heresy. While some of these losses are publicly acknowledged, others have been covered up, their records expunged, and all evidence of their existence erased. Dreadnoughts who fought alongside these lost chapters, or who witnessed their destruction, carry memories that the Imperium has decided are too dangerous or embarrassing to be preserved. The failures of specific campaigns and the incompetence or corruption of particular commanders represent a category of forbidden knowledge that cuts across the entire Imperial military structure. While some defeats are acknowledged as tragic but honorable, others have been hidden because they reveal uncomfortable truths about Imperial leadership. These might include campaigns that failed due to political interference, operations that were doomed from the start due to insufficient resources or flawed intelligence, or battles that were lost due to the pride or incompetence of high-ranking officers. Dreadnoughts, who participated in these failed campaigns, carry bitter memories of unnecessary sacrifice and avoidable defeat. The Months of Shame, a dark period in which the Space Wolves came into direct conflict with the Inquisition over the fate of civilians exposed to demonic corruption during the First War for Armageddon, represents a relatively recent example of conflict between Space Marines and other Imperial institutions. This incident involved the Space Wolves protecting refugees whom the Inquisition wanted to execute to prevent the spread of demonic taint. The subsequent conflict nearly escalated into open warfare between the Space Wolves and the Grey Knights, with intervention from other chapters barely preventing catastrophe. While the broad outlines of this event are known, many details remain suppressed, and dreadnoughts who participated in the conflict are strongly discouraged from discussing what occurred. The creation of some chapters during various foundings involved circumstances that remain classified. In some cases, this classification protects the origins of chapters whose gene seed comes from sources that might be considered questionable, such as loyalist elements from traitor legions or experimental genetic combinations. In other cases, the circumstances of a chapter's founding might reveal political machinations or dynastic conflicts among the High Lords of Terror that those in power would prefer to keep hidden. Ancient dreadnoughts who were present during these foundings carry knowledge about how chapters came to be that contradicts the heroic foundation myths that these chapters promote. The relationship between certain chapters and the Inquisition has at times been far more problematic than official accounts suggest. There have been instances where chapters have refused to cooperate with inquisitorial investigations, where they have hidden evidence of corruption or heresy within their ranks, or where they have actively obstructed inquisitorial operations. While the Inquisition has occasionally succeeded in forcing chapters to comply, more often these conflicts end in standoffs where both sides claim victory but neither achieves their objectives. Dreadnoughts who witness these conflicts understand the limits of the Inquisition's power and the degree to which Space Marine chapters can resist even the most powerful Imperial authorities when they choose to do so. The Mechanicum's monopoly on technology and its suppression of innovation has directly contributed to Imperial military defeats and lost opportunities. Dreadnoughts who remember the Great Crusade or the early millennia of the Imperium can testify to technologies that once existed but have since been lost, not through attrition or conquest, but through deliberate suppression by the Mechanicum. In some cases, this suppression was motivated by doctrinal concerns about technology that was deemed too dangerous. In others, it was simply a matter of protecting the Mechanicum's monopoly against potential competitors. The net effect has been technological stagnation that has left the Imperium increasingly vulnerable to its enemies. The actual death tolls of major campaigns and conflicts are often far higher than official records acknowledge. The Imperium has a long history of downplaying casualties, both to maintain morale and to obscure the extent of military and strategic failures. Dreadnoughts who fought in these campaigns remember the true costs, the billions of Imperial guardsmen who died in futile assaults, the entire chapters that were effectively destroyed, but whose losses were parceled out across official records to make them seem less catastrophic. This systemic dishonesty about casualties reflects the Imperium's fundamentally callous attitude toward human life and its willingness to sacrifice millions without acknowledging the scale of the waste. The existence of stable mutations within the human population of the Imperium, particularly among populations that have been isolated from the mainstream for extended periods, challenges the official doctrine that all mutation is corruption and must be purged. Some of these stable mutations provide benefits, such as enhanced strength, improved disease resistance, or the ability to survive in extreme environments. Dreadnoughts, who have fought on hundreds of worlds, have witnessed this diversity of human forms and understand that the Imperium's zero-tolerance policy toward physical variation is both unrealistic and counterproductive. However, this understanding cannot be publicly expressed without being accused of heresy. The role of prophecy and prescience in Imperial strategic planning is downplayed in official accounts, but is actually quite significant. Various institutions within the Imperium, including elements of the Inquisition, the Adeptus Astartes, and even the Administratum, make use of prophetic visions, tarot readings, and other forms of divination to inform their decisions. While this is officially justified as the Emperor's guidance working through his servants, it represents a form of warp taint that would be condemned as witchcraft if practiced by anyone outside the Imperial hierarchy. Dreadnoughts who have participated in campaigns planned around such prophecies understand the hypocrisy of condemning psychers and warpcraft while simultaneously relying on divination to make strategic decisions. The true nature of the Astronomicon and the suffering of the psychers who power it remains one of the Imperium's most closely guarded secrets. While it is known that the Astronomicon requires the sacrifice of psychers to maintain, the details of how these psychers are consumed, the torment they endure in their final days, and the scale of the ongoing sacrifice are carefully hidden from the general population. Dreadnoughts who have visited Terra or who have spoken with those who have witnessed the Astronomicon's operation carry knowledge of this systematic torture and murder conducted in the Emperor's name for the supposed good of the Imperium. This knowledge cannot be freely discussed because it would force uncomfortable questions about the moral foundation of imperial rule. The mechanisms of silence, how dreadnoughts are kept from speaking, understanding the many topics that ancient dreadnoughts are forbidden from discussing, naturally leads to the question of how this silence is enforced. The mechanisms used to control dreadnought testimony range from subtle psychological manipulation to outright physical threat, creating a comprehensive system of control that ensures dangerous knowledge remains suppressed. This system reveals much about the nature of power within the Imperium, and the lengths to which authorities will go to maintain their preferred narratives of history. The most fundamental mechanism of control is the simple fact that dreadnoughts spend the vast majority of their existence in a state of suspended animation. A dreadnought that sleeps for decades or centuries between awakenings has very few opportunities to speak with anyone, and those opportunities can be carefully managed. Chapter leadership controls when ancient dreadnoughts are awakened, for what purposes, and who is present during their awakening. This gives them enormous power to shape what questions are asked and what topics are discussed. A dreadnought who is awakened only for battles and immediately returned to sleep afterward has no opportunity to serve as a teacher or historian, no matter how much knowledge they possess. When dreadnoughts are awakened for consultation rather than combat, the setting and circumstances are carefully controlled. Typically, these consultations take place in the presence of chapter chaplains or other senior officers who can monitor the discussion and intervene if sensitive topics arise. The questions posed to the dreadnought are crafted to elicit specific information while avoiding broader discussions that might lead into forbidden territory. The dreadnought, aware of the scrutiny they are under, often self-censors, choosing their words carefully to avoid giving offense or triggering suspicion. Chapter chaplains play a particularly important role in managing dreadnought testimony. As the guardians of chapter doctrine and tradition, chaplains have both the authority and the knowledge to determine what historical information serves the chapter's interests and what information might be problematic. They counsel dreadnoughts about what should and should not be discussed, framing this guidance as concern for the dreadnought's well-being and for the chapter's reputation. This guidance is often accompanied by reminders of the dreadnought's duty to serve the chapter's interests, creating psychological pressure to cooperate with censorship. The psychological manipulation extends to how dreadnoughts are made to understand their own role. They are told that their purpose is to serve as weapons and as sources of tactical wisdom, not as historians or witnesses to controversial events. They are encouraged to think of themselves as tools of the chapter rather than as individuals with their own perspectives and agency. This framing makes it easier for dreadnoughts to accept restrictions on their speech, as they come to view these restrictions as natural and appropriate limitations on their role rather than as censorship. For dreadnoughts who resist this psychological manipulation or who insist on speaking about forbidden topics, more direct forms of control become necessary. The threat of permanent sleep is a powerful tool. A dreadnought who becomes too troublesome can simply be returned to their sarcophagus and never awakened again, left to dream in darkness until their systems finally fail. This fate is presented as a kind of death, a transition from service to rest. But from the dreadnought's perspective, it is imprisonment and abandonment, the permanent silencing of a voice that authorities have decided is too dangerous to be heard. The Mechanicum tech priests, who maintain dreadnought life support systems, represent another mechanism of control. These tech priests have the theoretical ability to alter dreadnought memories or to suppress specific memories through cybernetic manipulation. While such tampering is officially forbidden and considered a violation of the dreadnought's sacred bond with the machine spirit of their sarcophagus, it is known to occur in extreme cases. A dreadnought whose memories are deemed too dangerous might find that when they next awaken, certain periods of their past have become hazy or inaccessible, their consciousness carefully edited to remove the most problematic knowledge. The Inquisition represents the ultimate enforcement mechanism for controlling dreadnought testimony. When a dreadnought possesses knowledge that threatens not just their chapter, but the broader Imperium, the Inquisition may become involved. This involvement can take many forms, from direct interrogation to determine the extent of the dreadnought's knowledge to more permanent solutions. An Inquisitor can declare a dreadnought perdita, lost, erasing all records of their existence and ensuring they are never awakened again. In the most extreme cases, Inquisitors have ordered the destruction of dreadnoughts whose knowledge was deemed too dangerous to allow to exist. The destruction of a dreadnought is always publicly attributed to other causes. The official record will show that the dreadnought fell in battle, was destroyed by a catastrophic system failure, or was lost during transport. The truth, that they were executed to prevent them from revealing forbidden knowledge, remains known only to a very small circle of chapter leadership and inquisitorial personnel. This deception is necessary to maintain the fiction that dreadnoughts are honored and revered, while in reality they live under constant threat of elimination if they become inconvenient. Collective punishment serves as another form of control. When a dreadnought from a particular chapter speaks too freely about sensitive matters, the consequences may extend beyond that individual. The chapter as a whole may find itself under increased scrutiny from the Inquisition, may lose access to resources or support that it previously enjoyed, or may be assigned to more dangerous operations as a form of unofficial punishment. This creates peer pressure within the chapter against any dreadnought speaking out, as their brothers understand that doing so puts the entire chapter at risk. The isolation of dreadnoughts from outside contact is carefully maintained. Ancient dreadnoughts are rarely, if ever, allowed to interact with members of other chapters unsupervised, and interactions with civilians or Imperial Guard personnel are even more strictly controlled. This isolation serves multiple purposes. It prevents dreadnoughts from comparing notes with witnesses from other chapters who might have different perspectives on historical events, and it prevents any potentially dangerous testimony from reaching audiences beyond the chapter's control. A dreadnought who is never allowed to speak except to their own chapter's leadership can reveal nothing to outsiders, no matter how much they might wish to. The creation of alternative narratives represents a more subtle form of control. Rather than simply forbidding dreadnoughts from discussing certain topics, chapter leadership may actively promote different versions of events that contradict the dreadnought's memories. Over time, especially for dreadnoughts who spend long periods in suspended animation, the constant repetition of these alternative narratives may create doubt about their own recollection. A dreadnought who remembers events occurring one way, but who is repeatedly told that they happened differently, may eventually question whether their memory is accurate, particularly if they lack any external corroboration. The social pressure within chapters to conform to accepted narratives should not be underestimated. Dreadnoughts, despite their isolation in mechanical bodies, remain deeply connected to their chapters emotionally and psychologically. They care about how their brothers perceive them and about their standing within the chapter hierarchy. A dreadnought who gains a reputation for being difficult or controversial, who insists on discussing matters that make others uncomfortable, risks social isolation within their own chapter. This fear of alienation from the only community they have left can be a powerful motivator to remain silent about controversial topics. The legal and political structure of the Imperium provides no avenues for dreadnoughts to appeal decisions about their treatment or to challenge restrictions placed upon them. There exists no court where a dreadnought could argue that they have a right to speak freely about historical events, no political body that could overrule chapter leadership's decisions about when and how dreadnoughts are awakened. The absolute authority of chapter leadership over their own affairs, combined with the Inquisition's sweeping powers to suppress information deemed dangerous, creates a system in which dreadnoughts have no recourse if they disagree with how they are being treated. The destruction of written records and other physical evidence of forbidden events ensures that dreadnoughts cannot point to external corroboration of their testimonies. When all records of a particular event have been expunged, when all other witnesses have died or been silenced, a dreadnought's testimony becomes just one voice making claims that cannot be verified. Authorities can dismiss such testimony as the confused memories of an ancient warrior whose mind has been damaged by millennia of suspended animation, even when the testimony is completely accurate. The systematic destruction of evidence thus becomes a tool for discrediting witnesses, even when they speak the truth. The practical limitations of dreadnought existence also play a role in maintaining silence. A dreadnought cannot simply walk away from their chapter or seek asylum elsewhere. They are dependent on their chapter's tech priests for maintenance of their life support systems, for repairs when they are damaged, for the very basics of their continued existence. This complete dependency makes resistance difficult, as any dreadnought who seriously defied their chapter leadership could simply be allowed to deteriorate, their systems failing one by one until death finally claims them. The psychological toll of bearing forbidden knowledge, while being forbidden from speaking about it, represents a form of punishment in itself. Dreadnoughts who possess dangerous memories live under constant awareness that what they know makes them a target, that at any moment they might be deemed too dangerous to be allowed to continue existing. This creates a state of perpetual anxiety that compounds the already considerable psychological burden of dreadnought existence. Some dreadnoughts crack under this pressure, developing psychological problems that provide convenient justification for keeping them permanently asleep, or even for destroying them as mercy killings. The weight of forbidden knowledge, psychological and moral burdens. The enforcement mechanisms that keep ancient dreadnoughts silent about forbidden topics create enormous psychological burdens for these warriors. They exist in a state of profound contradiction, simultaneously honored as living links to their chapters' pasts and feared as potential threats to carefully maintained orthodoxies. This contradiction, combined with the isolation of dreadnought existence and the weight of memories they cannot share, creates psychological pressures that can break even the strongest will over time. The fundamental issue is the disconnect between what dreadnoughts are told their role should be and what their role actually is. They are awakened and told they are valued for their wisdom and experience, that their accumulated knowledge makes them invaluable resources for their chapters. Yet when they attempt to share that knowledge, they find that large portions of what they remember are deemed inappropriate for discussion. They are supposed to be teachers, but they are forbidden from teaching the most important lessons their experience has given them. They are supposed to be living links to history, but they are required to participate in the falsification and suppression of that history. This creates what might be called a moral injury, a wound to the conscience and sense of self that can be as devastating as any physical injury. Dreadnoughts who possess knowledge that they believe should be shared, information that could prevent future mistakes or correct dangerous misconceptions, are forced to remain silent while they watch their chapters and the broader Imperium make decisions based on incomplete or false information. They know that their silence makes them complicit in the perpetuation of ignorance and in whatever consequences follow from that ignorance. Yet they also know that speaking out would likely result in their immediate silencing and would accomplish nothing except their own destruction. Some dreadnoughts respond to this moral injury by rationalizing it, by convincing themselves that the suppression of dangerous knowledge is actually in the Imperium's best interest. They adopt the perspective that some truths are too destabilizing to be widely known, that the masses of humanity require comforting lies rather than harsh realities, and that their silence is actually a form of service to the Emperor. This rationalization allows them to reconcile their role as suppressors of truth with their self-image as loyal servants of the Imperium. But it comes at the cost of abandoning any pretense of intellectual honesty or moral independence. Other dreadnoughts internalize the suppression of their knowledge as a form of penance or sacrifice. They view their enforced silence as a burden they must bear for the good of their chapter, or the Imperium. A painful duty that they accept as part of their service. This framing allows them to maintain their sense of purpose and dignity even as they participate in the suppression of truth. However, it also transforms their existence into a form of perpetual martyrdom, as they suffer in silence, while knowing that their suffering serves a cause that requires them to betray their fundamental role as witnesses and teachers. A third group of dreadnoughts responds to the burden of forbidden knowledge with bitterness and despair. They recognize the corruption and dysfunction inherent in a system that systematically suppresses historical truth, and they come to see their own chapters and the Imperium itself as fundamentally dishonest institutions. These dreadnoughts may become cynical and withdrawn, performing their duties mechanically while internally detaching from any sense of loyalty or belonging. In extreme cases, this bitterness can curdle into active resentment, with dreadnoughts beginning to question whether the Imperium they serve is actually worthy of their service. The isolation of dreadnought existence amplifies these psychological burdens. Unlike normal space marines who can discuss their concerns and doubts with their brothers, dreadnoughts who harbor forbidden knowledge are profoundly alone. They cannot trust other members of their chapter with their doubts, because such sharing would make both parties vulnerable to accusations of spreading forbidden knowledge. They cannot seek counsel from chaplains, because chaplains are often the very officials responsible for enforcing silence. They exist in a kind of solitary confinement, locked within their mechanical shells, with only their memories for company. The long periods of suspended animation between awakenings create their own psychological challenges. Each time a dreadnought enters sleep, they do so with the uncertainty of whether they will ever be awakened again. Will they wake to find decades or centuries have passed? Will they wake to find that all those they knew are dead, replaced by strangers who view them as ancient relics rather than as living individuals? Or will they simply never wake at all, left to dream in darkness until their systems fail and consciousness fades away? This uncertainty creates a kind of existential anxiety that compounds all the other psychological burdens they bear. When dreadnoughts do awake, they face the challenge of reorienting themselves to a galaxy that has continued to change in their absence. The Imperium they remember from their last awakening may have evolved significantly, with new threats emerging, old enemies changing their tactics, and the political landscape shifting in ways that render their previous understanding obsolete. Yet they must quickly adapt to these changes, while simultaneously navigating the restrictions on what they can discuss and what questions they can ask. This need for constant adaptation while maintaining careful self-censorship is mentally exhausting. The relationship between dreadnoughts and their chapters becomes increasingly complicated as time passes. A dreadnought who was interred 300 years ago may still have living brothers who remember them as flesh and blood, who can relate to them as individuals rather than as venerable ancients. But a dreadnought who has existed for 3,000 years has no such connection. All those who knew them as a person are long dead. To their current battle brothers, they are legends, figures from history rather than comrades. This creates a profound sense of alienation as the dreadnought becomes increasingly disconnected from the living community of their chapter. This alienation is exacerbated by the fact that dreadnoughts who possess forbidden knowledge understand their chapter and the Imperium in ways that their younger brothers cannot. They know truths about their chapter's history that current members do not. They remember failures and compromises that have been erased from official records. They understand the gap between the chapter's heroic self-image and the more complex reality of its past. This knowledge creates a barrier between them and their brothers, a sense that they exist in a different reality than the one their chapter collectively inhabits. Some ancient dreadnoughts have lived long enough to watch the meaning of their service change across the millennia. A warrior who was interred during the Great Crusade, who believed they were fighting to create a unified, enlightened human civilization, has now witnessed that dream's complete failure. The Imperium they serve is not the vision they fought for, and in many ways represents its antithesis. This recognition that their sacrifice and suffering have ultimately served an end they never intended creates a profound crisis of meaning. Why continue to serve an Imperium that has betrayed everything they originally fought for? The question of whether to speak out, to risk everything by revealing forbidden knowledge in the hope that doing so might actually make a difference, haunts many ancient dreadnoughts. They understand that silence makes them complicit in the Imperium's dysfunction, but they also understand that speaking out would almost certainly accomplish nothing except their own destruction. This catch-22 creates a sense of helplessness and futility that can be psychologically devastating. They are witnesses to history who are forbidden from bearing witness, teachers who are forbidden from teaching, truth-tellers who are forced to participate in the perpetuation of lies. The few examples of dreadnoughts who have attempted to speak out about forbidden topics serve as cautionary tales that reinforce silence among other ancients. These dreadnoughts typically suffer swift and severe consequences. Some are immediately returned to permanent sleep, their warnings dismissed as the ravings of warriors whose minds have been damaged by millennia of stasis. Others are declared renegade or insane and destroyed, their names struck from the rolls of honor and their service forgotten. In either case, their fate serves as a clear message to other dreadnoughts about the consequences of refusing to accept censorship. The moral complexity of their situation is that in some cases, the suppression of knowledge may actually serve legitimate security interests. Some truths, if widely known, could genuinely undermine the Imperium's ability to defend itself, or could provide valuable intelligence to the Imperium's enemies. A dreadnought who reveals the full extent of a chapter's losses in a particular campaign might inadvertently encourage enemies to target that chapter. A dreadnought who discusses genetic flaws in their chapter's gene seed might provide information that enemies could exploit. The challenge is distinguishing between suppression that serves legitimate security needs and suppression that merely protects the powerful from accountability. Many dreadnoughts lack the context to make this distinction. They know what they witnessed, but they may not fully understand the broader political and strategic implications of revealing that information. This uncertainty can be paralyzing, as a dreadnought who genuinely wants to serve the Imperium's interests may be unsure whether speaking out would help or harm that cause. In the absence of clear guidance, most choose silence, erring on the side of caution even when that silence may itself be harmful. The relationship between knowledge and power becomes starkly visible in the situation of ancient dreadnoughts. They possess knowledge that could challenge powerful interests and destabilize established narratives, and precisely because of this, they are systematically disempowered and marginalized. Their physical dependency on their chapters for survival, their isolation from broader society, and the various mechanisms of control deployed against them all serve to ensure that their knowledge cannot be translated into actual influence. They are rendered politically and socially impotent, despite possessing some of the most valuable information in the Imperium. This powerlessness in the face of knowledge that should confer authority creates what might be called a knowing without power paradox. The dreadnoughts understand truths about the Imperium that those in positions of authority either do not know or refuse to acknowledge, yet they are completely unable to act on this understanding. They can see problems that others cannot see, can recognize patterns and connections that elude those with less historical perspective, yet they are forbidden from offering the insights that their unique perspective provides. This renders their vast experience and knowledge effectively useless for anything beyond narrow tactical applications. Guardians of uncomfortable truths, the future of forbidden knowledge. As we have explored throughout this examination, Ancient dreadnoughts occupy a unique and tragic position within the Imperium. They are living links to history who are forbidden from testifying about that history. They are supposed teachers who cannot teach the most important lessons they have learned. They are honored ancestors who are simultaneously feared and monitored as potential security threats. This paradoxical status reflects broader dysfunctions within the Imperium itself, revealing an empire that is simultaneously dependent on knowledge and terrified of it, that claims to value truth while systematically suppressing it. The question of what will happen to this forbidden knowledge in the future remains unanswered. Will it eventually die with the last of the ancient dreadnoughts, lost forever, as one by one these warriors are destroyed in battle or silenced permanently by those who fear what they know? Or will some of this knowledge survive, passed down through carefully controlled channels, or preserved in ways that authorities cannot easily suppress? The answer matters not just for historical understanding, but for the Imperium's survival, as the lessons contained in this forbidden knowledge could be crucial for navigating future challenges. There are reasons to believe that some forbidden knowledge may persist, despite efforts to suppress it. First, the very mechanisms of dreadnought existence create a form of resilience against total suppression. As long as dreadnoughts continue to be created and awakened, as long as warriors who witnessed forbidden events survive in their sarcophagi, the knowledge they carry remains potentially accessible. A change in political circumstances, a shift in chapter leadership, or a desperate need for information about past events could lead to ancient dreadnoughts being consulted about topics that were previously forbidden. Second, knowledge has a tendency to leak despite the best efforts to contain it. Dreadnoughts who are forbidden from speaking openly about certain topics may still communicate through hints and indirect references. A carefully worded answer to a permitted question might contain implications that lead a perceptive listener to understand suppressed truths. The very fact that certain topics are forbidden becomes information in itself, signaling to those who notice these gaps in the historical record that something important is being hidden. This creates a kind of outline of the suppressed knowledge, even if the details remain obscure. Third, the Imperium's power to suppress knowledge is not absolute. The Inquisition, chapter leadership, and other authorities can control what is said within their direct sphere of influence. But the Imperium is vast. Communications are unreliable, and enforcement is inconsistent. A dreadnought who speaks forbidden truths in a remote sector may never face consequences, simply because authorities never learn of what was said. Similarly, records that are ordered destroyed may survive through bureaucratic incompetence or deliberate preservation by sympathetic officials. The Imperium's very size and dysfunction create opportunities for knowledge to persist in unexpected places. However, there are equally strong reasons to believe that much forbidden knowledge is being permanently lost. The most obvious is simple attrition. Dreadnoughts, despite their mechanical protection, do eventually fall in battle. Each ancient who is destroyed takes their memories with them, and if they were the last witness to particular events, those events become unknowable to future generations. The steady drumbeat of casualties across the Imperium's endless wars is gradually erasing living memory of entire periods and events, replacing eyewitness testimony with second-hand accounts, and eventually with nothing at all. The deliberate destruction of dreadnoughts, who possess particularly dangerous knowledge, accelerates this process. When authorities decide that certain memories are too dangerous to be allowed to exist, they can and do eliminate the warriors who carry them. Over time, this selective culling removes precisely those dreadnoughts who possess the most valuable and challenging historical insights, skewing the surviving population of ancients toward those whose memories align more comfortably with official narratives. The psychological damage inflicted by the burden of forbidden knowledge also contributes to its loss. Dreadnoughts who suffer mental deterioration as a result of the stress of bearing dangerous memories may lose access to those very memories. Their consciousness may fracture, with traumatic or forbidden memories becoming dissociated and inaccessible. In some cases, this deterioration is natural the result of the immense psychological strain of dreadnought existence. In others, it may be deliberately induced through the ministrations of tech priests who have been ordered to make problematic memories inaccessible without outright destroying the dreadnought. The transformation of living memory into legend and myth represents another form of knowledge loss. Even when the basic outline of events is preserved, the loss of detail and context can fundamentally alter our understanding of what happened. A dreadnought who remembers the Horus heresy as a complex conflict involving difficult moral choices and strategic miscalculations sees something very different than a chapter librarian who knows the heresy only through sanitized historical accounts that present it as a simple struggle between good and evil. As the last eyewitnesses die, only the simplified, mythologized version remains. For the individual dreadnoughts who carry forbidden knowledge, the future holds little hope of relief from their burden. The forces that demand their silence show no signs of weakening, and the institutional interests that benefit from historical suppression remain powerful. These ancient warriors will continue to wake from their dreamless sleep to find themselves in an Imperium that simultaneously needs and fears what they know, that honors them as heroes while treating them as dangerous artifacts that must be carefully contained. The broader implications of this systematic suppression of historical truth extend far beyond the individual suffering of ancient dreadnoughts. An empire that cannot or will not learn from its past is condemned to repeat its mistakes. The Imperium in the 41st millennium shows clear signs of being caught in such cycles, making the same strategic errors, falling prey to the same political dysfunctions, and suffering the same catastrophic failures that dreadnought testimony could potentially help prevent. By silencing those who remember, the Imperium ensures its own stagnation and decline. Yet there may be a grim logic to this suppression. The Imperium is held together less by love or loyalty than by fear, propaganda, and carefully maintained myths. The heroic narratives of the Emperor's vision, the righteousness of the imperial cause, and the nobility of humanity's endless struggle against darkness serve as the glue that keeps a fragmented empire functioning. If these narratives were seriously undermined by revelations about the messy, morally complex reality of imperial history, the result might not be enlightened reform, but catastrophic collapse. The question then becomes whether maintaining comforting lies is worth the cost of preventing genuine understanding. The Imperium's authorities have answered this question clearly. Yes, the maintenance of social order and political stability justifies any amount of historical falsification. The dreadnoughts who possess forbidden knowledge represent a living challenge to this answer, a standing refutation of the claim that suppression serves the greater good. Their very existence testifies to the possibility of a different relationship with history and truth, even if that possibility can never be realized within the current imperial system. As we have seen throughout this exploration, the story of ancient dreadnoughts and their forbidden knowledge is ultimately a story about power, truth, and the costs of maintaining an empire through lies. These warriors, who sacrificed their humanity to serve the emperor, find themselves forced into a second sacrifice, the silencing of their testimony and the burial of truths that should be known. They stand as monuments to the Imperium's failures as much as to its glories, living reminders that the price of survival has been the corruption of everything the Imperium was supposed to represent. In the final analysis, the forbidden knowledge carried by ancient dreadnoughts matters not because it would overturn the current order, but because the fact that it is forbidden reveals the fundamental insecurity and dishonesty of that order. An empire confident in its legitimacy and in the righteousness of its cause would have no reason to fear the testimony of its most ancient warriors. The elaborate mechanisms of silence deployed against dreadnoughts demonstrate that the Imperium's authorities know, at some level, that their rule rests on foundations of myth and falsification that cannot survive serious historical scrutiny. The ancient dreadnoughts will continue to wake and sleep and wake again, bearing their burdens of forbidden memory until battle or time finally claims them. Each awakening brings them to a galaxy that has moved further from the truth of what they remember, where the gaps between history and mythology have grown wider, where the price of honesty has become higher. They are the last voices that could speak certain truths, and they are forbidden from speaking. In their silence, we can hear the Imperium's fear of its own past, and its recognition that the truth would not set it free, but would rather reveal the chains that bind it. For those of us who study the history of the Imperium, the existence of these silenced witnesses should serve as a constant reminder that what we think we know is incomplete and often inaccurate. The official narratives, however compelling and well documented they may appear, represent only what authorities have chosen to preserve and present. The real history, the full truth of what happened and why, exists in the memories of ancient warriors who are forbidden from sharing what they know. Until and unless that knowledge can be freed from the constraints that bind it, our understanding of the Imperium's past and present will remain fundamentally limited. If you found this exploration of ancient dreadnoughts and their forbidden knowledge enlightening, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue to delve into the darker corners of Warhammer lore, exploring the uncomfortable truths and hidden histories that make this universe so compelling. Share your thoughts in the comments below, particularly if you have theories about what other events might be suppressed, or about specific dreadnoughts whose testimonies you would like to hear. Remember that in the grim darkness of the far future, the most dangerous weapon is not a bolter or a power sword, but the truth that must not be spoken. Until next time, may the Emperor protect you, and may you never learn too much for your own good.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any, and yeah, sleep well.